Our One Nation leader Pauline Hanson has taken the gloves off in her response to the closing of the Gap report. Senator Hanson blames the scheme's poor outcomes on the failure of Indigenous Australians to take responsibility for themselves. Greens Senate leader Larissa Waters says the comments don't reflect the sentiment of the Senate or the majority of Australians. The report showed just 2 of the 7 targets are on track to be achieved. Join me now as One Nation Queensland Senator Malcolm Roberts in Canberra. Well, Malcolm, thank you for joining us. What did you think of the boss's speech? Did you think it reflected what a lot of people in this country would be thinking?
Well, it certainly does, and most important of all, as with everything Pauline says, it reflects the fact, Peter. The facts, Peter. Absolutely correct in every detail. She has been around those towns, as have I, up on the Cape and Western Queensland, northwestern Queensland, and she's spot on.
Yeah, well, it certainly created a lot of controversy. There's no doubt about that, Malcolm. And, you know, I always complain that we seem to have these debates in this country about whether we should have Australia Day on January 26, when the real key to this country is tackling problems, whether it's education, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's, you know, drunkenness, all those things that we see that affects the way in which Aboriginals live in this country. And yet we've got these green-tinged councils and lefties on Twitter wanting to have a debate about whether, in fact, we should have Australia Day January 26. Where are their priorities, Malcolm?
Well, their priorities are on either looking good or smearing others. And that shows, Peter, that they don't have the facts. Because if they had the facts, they'd engage in a rational argument. And they just don't do that. They'd rather smear and malign and deviate. So, you know, that just, every time someone smears me or ridicules me, I just say, well, thanks for confirming my argument, because you haven't got one.
Now, Malcolm, we had a poll that was in the Courier Mail only a few days ago, and it showed that One Nation in Queensland was soaring, up 3%, 15% primary, which shows to me that the major parties, the Labor Party and the LNP, are doing it tough here, and their messaging is not getting out. The latest is that the Queensland LNP are considering splitting from their national body. There's been a lot going on in Canberra this week, Malcolm. You must be watching very closely and seeing that, you know, the Nationals are imploding in many respects.
Well, we don't gloat on that because they're a part of the coalition government, and they're making a mess of things, the coalition, because you said a minute ago, they're focusing on messaging, and that's the problem. Pauline and I focus on listening to what people say, understanding the issues, getting the facts, and then putting up a strong argument. Sadly, the Labor Party has abandoned its roots, abandoned workers, and gone for the PC brigade and to look good. And Scotty Morrison is now Scotty from marketing. And, you know, what they're doing is they're building facades and selling them. What people want is to know that politicians are listening, to know that the politicians are understanding, because politicians are their representatives of the people, and should be doing the will of the people. That's what's missing from the 2 tired old parties.
Let's talk a bit about this inland rail proposal in Western Queensland. And I know there's a lot of debate going on at the moment around places like Millmerran and Dalby. You've obviously been lobbied as a Queensland senator, and I know your Liberal colleague in Queensland has also been lobbied on this. There's some suggestion that floodplain warnings have not been heeded. What are you hearing on this, Malcolm?
Well, we've been following the Inland Rail and prosecuting the argument that it needs to be done properly. We believe in the Inland Rail, but I've got very grave doubts about the option that the government picked. So right from the concept stage, I believe they've got it wrong. Now, we understand there's a much better leader of the Inland Rail now in Richard Wankmuller, and I think he's got an American accent, but he's showing signs, and the people on the ground in southern Queensland are saying that he's doing a much better job. But they've got some fundamentals that were laid down early in the concepts, and they have got to get over them. You're exactly correct. People are terrified, literally terrified. You can see people just actually shaky about what the proposals are because of the crossing the floodplain near Millmerran and other floodplains. These floodplains are up to 30 kilometres wide. I mean, we're talking about massive floods, and they're talking about putting a railway line across there with an embankment. That is a 30-kilometre dam wall. And so these are enormous challenges that they're facing there. I think 60% of the cost of the inland rail from 4 or 5 kilometres from the Port of Melbourne to 38 kilometres from the Port of Brisbane are in southern Queensland because of the engineering feats, because they have to go across those floodplains that are black soil. The piers need to go down 30 metres into the black soil, and they have to deal with, at times, ferocious flooding. So people are rightly concerned, because if they're on the upstream of that dam wall, then they're going to be flooded and possibly destroyed and killed.
Now, Malcolm, I know One Nation have been a very strong advocate for our dairy farming industry in recent years, and I've had Pauline on the show, and she's mounted very strong arguments in relation to the dairy industry. We had a chap at the Oscars the other night, a bloke called Wokem Phoenix, very well appropriately named. He had a crack at the dairy industry. He basically said we should all go vegan, get into the almond milk and the soy milk and so forth, and he was sort of rabbiting on about how we take advantage of cows and whatever. I mean, coming from Hollywood actors, you must look at these people and think, you know, what planet are they on?
Well, exactly, and they're certainly not on planet Earth, because their comments about climate change don't reflect the reality on our planet. You know, what they're doing is they're going off cyclones or storms or floods or droughts, and they're common all around the world, and especially in our country. What they don't understand is that their lifespan, in fact their conscious lifespan, is probably only about 5 years, but their lifespan's probably 30 to 50 years. The cycles are thousands of years. And, you know, we see these extreme events come and go. And in fact, they're not extreme, really. They're just part of what nature's cycles, weather cycles. And so these people show a complete lack of understanding of nature, and yet they pretend to be supporting nature. It's complete rubbish.
Just on that whole climate change issue, and we've had the bushfires, of course, Malcolm, and now we're getting plenty of rain in Queensland. There was a piece in today's Oz by Graham Lloyd about how the Bureau of Meteorology had failed to sort of detect that we might get a little bit of rain in February, suggesting that it was more likely April before we saw any rain. I mean, you know, you got one job and they can't get that right. But we also see with the bushfires, you know, the nexus these activists come up with between climate change and bushfires. But what they don't do, Malcolm, is then tell you the story about how we've neglected the backburning role that we've so traditionally done in this country, because a lot of the environmentalists have somehow sort of hijacked, if you like, some of the conservation departments in this country. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, they've hijacked the government departments, they've hijacked universities, they've hijacked government agencies, and so they're spreading nonsense. And, you know, it's first of all very important to acknowledge the grief and the suffering that people have endured in recent months. And while not dismissing that or downplaying it in any way whatsoever, it is, unfortunately, fires are unfortunately a natural trait of this country. And we've had bigger fires, more ferocious fires that have burned out 4 times the area that has been burned out this summer. 4 times. And so we've had fires in 1939 that took 71 lives. We've had fires that took out more property. 1974, 75, there were fires that took out, as I said, four times the burned area. That doesn't diminish in any way a firefighter who has faced this fire wall, and it doesn't diminish in any way the grief and the sadness. But I really detest the Greens and the other activists who are piling on top of these people and actually then telling lies about the climate, lies about fires. We know that exactly what you said, Peter, you're absolutely correct. It's the Greens and the other activists who've stopped the fire trails being maintained, stopped the back burning, stopped the cool burning, and we know that they have contributed enormously. But there's one other group as well, and that's the Queensland Labor Party in particular, but to some extent the Liberal Party, because they have interfered with farmers' land use rights. And that started with John Howard and Rob Borbidge, went on with John Howard and Peter Beattie, and then Anna Bligh, and now Anastasia Palaszczuk and Jackie Trad. They are preventing farmers from managing their vegetation. A farmer buys a piece of land. He or she buys the water on it, buys the soil on it, buys the vegetation on it, and they need to be able to manage that. They can't. And so the vegetation flourishes, then it dies in the heat and in the drought, which is natural, and then it becomes a tinderbox, and that kills people. And so the governments, the greenies, the activists, they're the ones responsible because they're pushing rubbish and they're telling lies that are affecting people and raising hazards enormously.
Malcolm Roberts, One Nation Queensland Senator, thanks for joining us on Sky News Across Australia.
You're welcome, Peter.